let's talk about the internet weather. The top 10 most probed ports for this week. The first 6 places have not changed from last week, which is kind of astounding. So we've got 23 TCP in first place. That's Telnet, and that's still going strong. 445 TCP is SMB. 22 TCP is SSH. 1433 Microsoft SQL Server. 81 TCP is a web port, but it is a vulnerability associated with webcams that is being scanned heavily by the Satori botnet. 3389 is remote desktop protocol. Now to the ones that have changed. In 7th place, we have 5555 TCP, which is the Android Remote Debug Bridge. 443 TCP is general HTTPS, followed by 80 TCP is general HTTP. And both of those could be any number of different web servers that are being scanned. And rounding out the bottom at number 10 is 21 TCP, and that's FTP. Taking a look at the most sources probing, not a whole lot of movement here either. A bunch of things have moved up and down one spot, but not a whole lot of moving and shaking going on. 445 TCP we've talked about. I'm just going to skip down to the ones that are a little bit different for this list.
Yeah.
8080 TCP is another web port. Could be a number of different things. Could be IoT devices. Could be like a web proxy. Again, we don't have a really good number on what exactly is being scanned there. 5431, I believe, is related to a Broadcom bug that we've talked about on the show before. 5555 we talked about. 80ICMP is echo requests. That's really just the number of pings that are being sent. So a whole lot of hosts are sending pings at this time. 81 TCP, I think we talked about. 8081 is another one of those web type ports. Again, I believe that is related to a specific vulnerability. And 6881 is, again, BitTorrent, and usually that is a result of just large amounts of BitTorrent traffic. Single host to a large number of other hosts. Looks a lot like scanning, but it's more likely peer-to-peer. It seems like the major ports that are being scanned did not switch, and I would chalk that up to the size of the botnets that are scanning these particular ports being so overwhelmingly large that there's no chance for another port to come in unless one of those players decides to change its focus.
I think it's of note that these botnets are getting so big that anything that they do, it can't be changed by some small new modification.
So scan SIPs on port 445, which is SMB, still slowly creeping up.
Still reminiscent of WannaCry?
Still the same kind of traffic as WannaCry. Still mostly the same pattern that we saw.
Okay.
I think there are other folks out there using the same exploits, but I would guess that WannaCry is still one of the significant ones, since it was a worm, since it did infect a large number of hosts. There was a really interesting article about the fact that these vulnerabilities are still active. And I remember the author's point was that there are a significant number of Windows hosts that just don't get patches. Either they're old hosts, an older version of Windows that's out of support, or they're pirate versions of Windows that will never get patches. And people were still using those because, hey, they work.
They're free.
So, yeah. Kind of an interesting look at that ecosystem that allows these vulnerabilities to still have a whole lot of pull. Port 81 TCP, I think back in the February timeframe, there was a new vulnerability discovered for these wireless IP cameras that are being attached to the internet. And I think that's what we see here mostly. Satori is still one of the big heavyweights in terms of scanning on the internet. So the vulnerabilities that Satori scans for tend to show up in our top 10. And we've seen some spikes. This is a 90-day view. It's not necessarily the highest it's ever been, but still considerable. 23 TCP, still going strong. Not a whole lot of change here. Flows per hour are somewhere in the range of 900 million. Up and
Still
down.
primarily IoT devices, you think?
I would hazard a guess.
Yeah.
I mean, most of these devices have the vulnerabilities. They have a Telnet, and no one bothered to tell anybody.
Right.
They've got a got a default password set, and from there they just go and find more devices just like them.
Cool.
Port 8081 is another web one. I tend to think it's Apache Tomcat. Again, we don't have the traffic to look at to say exactly what's being scanned for here, but the Apache Tomcat admin port is 8081. I've seen a significant number of hosts that leave the default password on for that. I mean, honestly, Tomcat, from what I understand, you don't actually have to have it exposed, the admin interface, to run anything using Tomcat, but some people may have misconfigured it and left it open and exposed to the internet. So there was a pretty big uptick in scanning in the last week or so. Went from, I want to say, 2,000 up to the 8,000 scan sources per hour range. So someone's more interested in this one again.
Okay.
5555 I thought was kind of neat. I had to put in a 250-day view, and it's a weird number, but I didn't want to, because 365 showed a long range over here on the left where it was dead quiet. And then someone became interested in it here around, mid-February. We had a huge spike in the middle of July for it, and it's gone down since then, but in the last couple of days, you can see at the far right, we've had another uptick in it. And this is ADB. This is a debug bridge that's exposed by Android devices in a certain configuration. A lot of home media player devices will have this, and I think there's a common hack for Amazon Fire devices that exposes this. Like it's some sort of routing or something like that. You can get extra software running on it. But people will accidentally leave that exposed. And I actually read an article that there is a minor worm called FBot that's taking advantage of these exposed Android debug bridges to install crypto mining software. So I can't say for certain if any one of these spikes is related directly to FBot, but it's it's one more family that's taking advantage of this vulnerability. And then this one I thought was kind of interesting. It didn't show up in our top 10s on either one, but we had some alerts saying that this has gone way above its baseline. And this is port 10250 TCP. It's Kubernetes. This is another one of those systems that people will deploy stuff with on the inside of a network, and the assumption for those who designed it was like, well, it'll be on the inside of a network, so we don't need to put any sort of authentication into our endpoints. This HTTP endpoint apparently has full unauthenticated access to the system. There's an article on Medium that somebody wrote about using it to install backdoors on the thing, and the top source of scanning is a virtual private server company in the US. It's another situation where this is software that was never intended to be connected directly to the internet. Someone built it without security in mind because their threat model said, no one will ever do this. And naturally, people did it. We've seen a spike here. I think that's the end of August, where we hit 100 million scan flows per hour. So not insignificant, but the number of sources is fairly low. And that's it.
Cool. Thanks, Matt.